Lucas Gray's hands gripped the steering wheel at 8:15 a.m., knuckles white against black leather. 38 minutes to the interview. 38 minutes to prove he could keep his son.
Don't
The
worry, I'll
eviction
get you out of
notice
here.
burned in his pocket like a countdown clock, and Vincent Hayes' text glowed on the dashboard. Court hearing Friday. Better have good news. Then the sedan flipped ahead, metal screaming, glass exploding across Highway 26, smoke rising thick and black. A woman's scream cut through the morning air, faint but desperate. Lucas checked his watch. 37 minutes now. His foot hovered over the gas pedal. Through the rearview mirror, he saw Caleb's terrified eyes watching him. Every second he stopped was a second closer to losing everything. The apartment, the custody, the last shred of dignity he had left. The interview that would save them was slipping away with each breath. But that scream kept echoing. That smoke kept rising. And some choices tear a man apart before he even makes them. When that stranger showed up at his door days later, she carried the one thing Lucas never expected to find in the wreckage of his life. The borrowed suit pulled tight across Lucas's shoulders as he merged onto Highway 26, morning sun cutting sharp angles through the windshield. He adjusted the rearview mirror and caught Caleb in the back seat, small hands clutching his backpack, brown eyes watching the road with quiet attention that made Lucas's chest ache. 8 months of unemployment had taught his 7-year-old son to be careful with hope, to measure his words like precious things that might shatter if spoken too loud. The digital clock blinked to 8:16, and Lucas calculated distances and traffic patterns, the way drowning men count seconds between breaths. "Dad, are you going to get the job?" Caleb's voice carried the weight of too many disappointments, too many nights listening to his father make promises that crumbled like sand. Lucas forced something resembling a smile. "That's the plan, buddy." But plans had been falling apart for months now, ever since the morning he'd walked out of Portland General Hospital with a termination letter and the knowledge that one wrong call had ended Margaret Chen's life instead of saving it. The eviction notice in his pocket proved how thoroughly his world had unraveled, how close they were to losing even the shabby apartment that barely qualified as home. His phone buzzed against the cup holder, Vincent Hayes' name glowing like a threat. Lucas didn't need to read the message to know what it said. The custody hearing loomed on Friday, and his ex-wife's attorney took particular pleasure in cataloguing every failure, every missed opportunity, every reason Caleb deserved better than a father who couldn't keep a job or pay rent on time. Through the mirror, Lucas watched his son pretending not to notice the tension radiating from the driver's seat, and guilt settled over him like a familiar coat he couldn't take off. They passed Caleb's school, a brick building where his son spent days pretending everything was normal while other kids talked about vacations and video games and futures that felt guaranteed. Lucas had volunteered to drive him this morning before the interview, clinging to routines that felt sacred in their simplicity. Drop off his son, drive to Meridian Health Systems, walk in with his head high, prove he was still the man he used to be, not the ghost wearing his face who'd spent 8 months watching everything slip away. The memory ambushed him without warning, Margaret Chen's face pale and slack, blood spreading across white sheets, the flat-line scream of monitors, his own voice hoarse and desperate, calling for help that came too late. He'd made the call to start CPR when protocol said, "Wait for the attending physician." He'd been wrong. She'd died. And every day since, Lucas had carried that weight, had felt it pressing down on his lungs until breathing became an act of will rather than instinct. He shook his head hard, forcing the past back into its locked box. The highway stretched ahead, relatively clear for a Monday morning. 8:17. If traffic stayed light, he'd make it with 15 minutes to spare. Enough time to find parking, straighten his borrowed suit, take 3 deep breaths and walk through those doors like a man who belonged there. This interview wasn't just an opportunity. It was a lifeline thrown to a drowning man, and Lucas knew exactly how quickly desperate fingers could lose their grip. The truck appeared in his peripheral vision first, a massive semi cutting across lanes, trailer fishtailing as the driver overcorrected on slick pavement. Lucas's foot hit the brake instinctively, 8 years of paramedic training still wired into reflexes that didn't need conscious thought. The black sedan 3 cars ahead didn't react fast enough. Metal screamed, glass exploded like deadly snow. The sedan spun twice before momentum carried it toward the embankment, rolling once, twice, settling at a sickening angle with the passenger side crushed and the driver's side exposed like an open wound. Traffic lurched to a halt, cars scattered across 3 lanes, drivers already reaching for phones with shaking hands. Lucas's car idled in the center lane, his foot still pressed against the brake, breath caught somewhere between his lungs and his throat. Smoke began rising from the sedan's hood, thin at first, then thicker, darker, carrying the acrid smell of burning oil and something worse, something that made every nerve ending scream danger. He checked his watch. 8:22. 38 minutes until the interview that would decide whether he kept his son. People emerged from their vehicles, standing at safe distances, phones raised to capture footage they'd share later with appropriate expressions of shock. Someone would call 911. Someone probably already had. Ambulances would arrive soon, professionals who knew what they were doing, people who hadn't been fired for making the wrong call when a life hung in the balance. Lucas's hands stayed locked on the steering wheel, knuckles white against black leather, while his mind performed calculations he didn't want to acknowledge. Then he heard it, faint beneath the hiss of escaping steam and the murmur of gathering onlookers, but unmistakable. A woman's scream. Not loud, not the panic-driven sound of someone in shock. This was weaker, desperate, the sound of someone fighting to stay conscious while their body tried to shut down. Lucas stared at the wreckage, at smoke getting thicker by the second, at the very real possibility of fire if fuel was leaking and the engine was hot enough and any one of a dozen variables went catastrophically wrong. "Dad." Caleb's voice was small, frightened, pulling Lucas back to the present. "Dad, that lady." His son's eyes were huge in the rearview mirror, reflecting the same scene Lucas was watching, the same calculation every decent person had to make when confronted with someone else's emergency. Stay safe. Let professionals handle it. Protect yourself and the people who depend on you. Except Lucas had been a professional once, before Margaret Chen, before the termination letter, before 8 months of unemployment had stripped away everything except the muscle memory of saving lives. His watch face caught the morning sun. 8:23. 37 minutes. If he stopped, if he ran toward that wreckage, if he did what every cell in his body was screaming at him to do, he was done. Vincent Hayes would stand in front of a judge and say the words that would end everything. "Your Honor, Mr. Gray missed yet another job interview, his 3rd failed opportunity this month. Clearly, he cannot provide the stability this child needs." And the judge would nod with something like pity in her eyes and sign the papers that would take Caleb away. But that scream echoed in his ears, mixing with another scream from another time, Margaret Chen's daughter standing in a hospital hallway, asking why nobody had done more, why her mother had died while doctors stood around following protocol instead of fighting for her life. Lucas had fought. He'd made the wrong call, but he'd fought. And sitting here now, listening to another woman scream while smoke rose and seconds ticked away, how many wrong calls could one man make before he stopped being the person he thought he was? His hand moved to the door handle without conscious decision, muscle memory overriding logic, training overriding fear. "Caleb," he said, voice rough with things he couldn't name. "Stay in the car. Lock the doors. Don't come out no matter what happens." He opened the door, one foot already on pavement that felt too solid beneath him, too real for a choice that felt like stepping off a cliff. "But Dad, your interview." Caleb's voice cracked on the last word, and Lucas heard every fear his son was too young to articulate. Your interview that will save us. Your interview that will keep us together. Your interview that's the only thing standing between us and disaster. I know, buddy. Lucas's voice was steady, even though his hands were shaking. I know. He ran toward the wreckage, not the desperate sprint of someone trying to be a hero, but the controlled movement of someone who'd done this before, assessing the scene as he moved, calculating risks, looking for hazards that could turn rescue into tragedy. The sedan was stable for now, but that smoke meant time was a luxury he didn't have. People watched him go, some calling out warnings, others just staring with phones raised like this was entertainment instead of someone's life bleeding away. Lucas dropped to his knees beside the driver's side window and looked inside. The woman was conscious but fading, eyes struggling to focus through pain and shock. Blood ran from a gash on her forehead, matting dark hair against skin gone pale as paper. Her left leg was pinned beneath the dashboard, twisted at an angle that made Lucas's stomach turn with professional recognition of just how bad this was. He pulled out his phone and dialed 911 with fingers that felt steadier than they had any right to be. Hey, he said, voice calm despite his hammering heart. Can you hear me? She nodded barely. I'm Lucas. I'm going to help you. What's your name? The operator answered in his ear, asking questions he'd answered 1,000 times before. He rattled off information in clipped, efficient language while keeping his eyes locked on the woman's face, keeping her present, keeping her conscious. Rachel. Her voice was thread-thin, barely audible over the hiss of escaping steam. My son. I have to pick up my son. Her eyes were starting to drift, focus slipping away like water through cupped hands. Lucas squeezed her hand through the shattered window, feeling how cold her fingers were, how weak her grip. You're going to see your son again, Rachel. I promise. He was already assessing injuries with the automatic efficiency of someone who'd spent a decade doing this. Head wound significant, but not immediately life-threatening. Leg definitely broken, possibly crushed. He couldn't see her right side, couldn't tell what other damage the impact had caused. The operator was saying something about estimated arrival time, but Lucas had already ended the call because he'd just heard the sharp hiss of escaping fuel and everything had changed. The driver's side door was jammed solid, metal crumpled in ways that would require professional equipment to fix. Lucas pulled anyway, leveraging his weight against physics, but the door wouldn't budge. The window was shattered, leaving a gap just wide enough for him to reach through. He grabbed Rachel's hand again and squeezed hard enough to hurt, hard enough to pull her back from wherever her mind was trying to escape to. Rachel, I need you to stay with me. Can you do that? She nodded, but her eyes said she wasn't sure. Lucas pulled off his suit jacket, the one he'd borrowed from a neighbor, the one he'd planned to wear while convincing strangers he was worth hiring, and pressed it against the wound on her forehead. Hold this here. Press hard. Her hand came up weak and trembling to hold the makeshift bandage, and Lucas worked quickly to assess what he could reach through the window. The seatbelt was locked tight across her chest, mechanism jammed from the impact. Lucas needed a knife to cut it, needed tools to pry open the door, needed the paramedics who were still precious minutes away, needed time that was running out with every second that smoke got thicker and flames got closer to the fuel tank. A man from the gathering crowd approached with a pocket knife, and Lucas took it without a word, sawing through thick fabric while talking to Rachel in a steady stream of words designed to keep her present. What's your son's name? The seatbelt gave way strand by strand, each cut bringing her closer to freedom and closer to the moment where moving her could cause catastrophic damage if he did it wrong. Andrew. He's 9. He's waiting for me. Rachel's voice was fading, strength draining away with blood loss and shock. Lucas dropped the knife and reached through the window to support her weight as the seatbelt released. And gravity tried to pull her sideways. She cried out, a sound that would live in his nightmares alongside Margaret Chen's daughter's screams. Sirens wailed in the distance, getting closer but not close enough. The smoke carried visible flames now, licking at the engine block with hungry persistence. Lucas had maybe 2 minutes before this car became a coffin. Rachel's leg was still pinned beneath the dashboard, trapped in ways that meant moving her without freeing that leg first could cause permanent damage. But leaving her in a car that was about to explode would cause something much more permanent than nerve damage. "Rachel, this is gonna hurt. I need you to know that. But I have to get you out now." She nodded through tears mixing with blood on her face, and Lucas pulled. She screamed. The sound cut through him like broken glass, sharp and terrible, but her leg came free and her body came through the window, and Lucas had her in his arms, running 40 feet from the wreckage, then 60, then 100. Before the explosion cracked the morning air with heat, he felt across his back as he hunched over her body, shielding her from debris raining down around them. Lucas lowered Rachel gently to the pavement and checked vitals with shaking hands. Pulse weak but present. Breathing shallow but steady. The leg was bad, really bad, but she was alive and going to stay that way. The ambulance screeched to a halt 30 seconds later, and paramedics took over with smooth efficiency. They asked questions. Lucas answered in the same clipped professional language, and they nodded, recognizing one of their own, even though his borrowed suit was covered in blood, and his hands wouldn't stop trembling. One paramedic looked at him as they loaded Rachel onto the stretcher. "You did good, man. Real good. She's gonna make it because of you." Lucas nodded, but couldn't speak past the tightness in his throat. He watched the ambulance pull away with lights flashing and sirens screaming, watched until it disappeared around a curve, and only then did he remember to check his watch. 8:52. 8 minutes until the interview that would decide whether he kept his son. His phone rang, the screen displaying a number he'd memorized like a prayer. "Mr. Gray, this is Jennifer from Meridian Health Systems. It's 9 o'clock. We were expecting you for your interview." Her voice carried professional impatience that made his stomach drop into freefall. Lucas looked around at the chaos. Police directing traffic, firefighters spraying foam, people still recording everything. At Caleb watching from the car with huge frightened eyes, at his own hands covered in Rachel's blood. There was an accident. A bad one. Someone was trapped and I had to... Mr. Gray, I understand emergencies happen." Her tone suggested she understood nothing of the sort. "But we have other candidates scheduled today, and we can't hold the position for someone who can't commit to showing up on time. I'm sorry, but we've decided to move forward with other candidates. We appreciate your interest." The line went dead. Lucas stood on the roadside holding a phone that had just delivered the death sentence to every hope he'd been carrying. A police officer approached with a notebook, taking his statement with professional courtesy. Name. Address. What he'd seen. What he'd done. The officer thanked him for his quick action, said the woman was going to be okay because of him. The words felt like they were coming through water, filtered and distant and meaningless against the weight of what Lucas had just lost. When the officer finally left, Lucas walked back to his car on legs that felt like they belonged to someone else. Caleb had unlocked the door and stood beside it, small and scared, and trying so hard to be brave. "Dad, did you get the job?" The question hung in the morning air like smoke, and Lucas opened his mouth to lie, to protect his son from one more disappointment. But the truth came out instead, flat and final. "No, buddy, I didn't get the job." Caleb's face crumpled, not crying because he was too old for that now, but something in his eyes broke a little. Lucas felt it in his own chest like a mirror crack spreading through everything he'd been trying to hold together. "But you saved that lady. You're a hero." Caleb's voice was small, confused, trying to make sense of a world where doing the right thing meant losing everything. "Heroes don't lose their kids," Lucas said, then immediately regretted it. He knelt down, put his hands on Caleb's shoulders. "I'm sorry. I shouldn't have said that. Come on, let's go home." The drive back was silent, Lucas taking surface streets because he couldn't face Highway 26 again, couldn't look at the scene of his failure-turned monument. They arrived at the apartment complex just after 10, and Lucas saw the bright red paper taped to their door from the parking lot. His heart, which he'd thought couldn't sink any lower, found new depths. The eviction notice was exactly what he'd expected. Final notice: tenant has 10 days to vacate premises or face legal action. Outstanding balance, $2,473. Caleb read over his shoulder, and Lucas felt his son's fear like a physical weight pressing down on both of them. "What does that mean?" Caleb asked, though his voice said he already knew. "It means we need to find somewhere else to live." Lucas unlocked the apartment door, and they stepped into the space he'd tried so hard to make into a home. Drawings on the walls. Clean despite everything. Some semblance of normalcy that was about to dissolve like sugar in rain. He sent Caleb to wash up and stood in the bathroom scrubbing Rachel's blood from his hands, watching the water run pink, then red, then pink again, then finally clear. But his hands still felt dirty. Everything felt dirty. His phone buzzed with a text from Vincent Hayes, just a photo of court documents with Friday's date highlighted in yellow. The custody hearing. 3 days away. Lucas sat on the edge of the bathtub and put his head in his hands, feeling the full weight of what he'd done settling over him like a burial shroud. He'd made the right choice on that highway. He knew he had. You don't leave someone to die because you have somewhere to be. But right choices had consequences, and those consequences were about to cost him the only thing that mattered. The next 2 days passed in a blur of desperate phone calls and closed doors. Lucas contacted every hospital, every clinic, every medical facility within 50 miles. Most didn't answer. The ones that did took his information with polite disinterest and promised to keep his resume on file, which was professional code for "we'll never call you." One hiring manager was brutally honest. "Mr. Gray, that termination from Portland General is a red flag. It's going to be very difficult for you to find work in emergency medicine." Tuesday was worse. Lucas walked into every restaurant, every retail store, every place with a help wanted sign, trying to find anything that would show a judge he was employable. He filled out 23 applications and had nothing to show for it except sore feet and a growing sense of desperation that sat in his chest like a stone, getting heavier with each rejection. By evening he was making dinner, boxed pasta and canned sauce for the 4th time that week, when someone knocked on the door. Lucas assumed it was the landlord or maybe Vincent Hayes showing up to gloat. He was wrong on both counts. The woman standing in the hallway was in her early 40s, professional despite the crutches she leaned on and the bandage visible on her forehead. She wore a business suit that probably cost more than Lucas's monthly rent, and she was looking at him with an expression he couldn't quite read. "You saved my life," she said without preamble. "I had to find you." Recognition hit Lucas like a physical blow, stealing his breath and making the hallway tilt sideways. "Rachel." She nodded, and Lucas stepped aside because he didn't know what else to do. She moved into the living room with careful steps, and Caleb emerged from his bedroom, curious and cautious. "You're the lady from the car." Rachel smiled at him, warm and genuine despite the pain she had to be in. "I am. You must be Caleb. Your dad told me about you while he was saving my life." She looked at Lucas, and there was something in her eyes that made him deeply uncomfortable. "The doctors said if I'd stayed in that car another 2 minutes, I wouldn't have made it. The fire spread faster than anyone expected." Lucas nodded, unsure what to say. Unsure why she was here in his shabby apartment, looking at him like he'd done something extraordinary instead of something that had cost him everything. "How did you find us?" Caleb asked, and Rachel explained about the police report, about waking up in the hospital wanting to know who'd saved her, about tracking down the man named Lucas Gray who'd pulled her from a burning car and stayed until the ambulance came. "The interview you missed was with my company," Rachel said, turning to Lucas with an intensity that made him want to step backward. "Meridian Health Systems. I'm the CEO." The room tilted. Lucas grabbed the back of a chair to steady himself, trying to process words that didn't make sense, trying to understand how the woman he'd saved was the same person who was supposed to interview him. "When you didn't show up, I asked our HR director to find out why. She said you'd called about an accident, but that we'd moved on to other candidates." Rachel's expression hardened with something that looked like anger, but not at Lucas. "She didn't tell me the accident was the one I was in, that the reason you missed the interview was because you were saving my life." Lucas couldn't breathe, couldn't think, couldn't do anything except stand there while Rachel explained that she'd read his file, his entire file, including the incident with Margaret Chen. "I know you were fired for trying CPR when protocol said wait. I also know that Margaret Chen's family wrote letters to the hospital board. Not complaints. Thank you letters. They said you were the only person who treated their mother like a human being instead of a liability." Lucas felt his throat closing. He hadn't known about those letters. Nobody had told him. "You were fired for breaking protocol, Mr. Gray. Not for lack of skill, not for negligence, for caring too much in a system that punishes compassion." Rachel moved closer, awkward on her crutches but determined. "That's exactly the kind of person I want in my organization." "I can't accept a job because you're grateful," Lucas heard himself say. Pride warring with desperation, independence fighting with the reality of 10 days until eviction and 2 days until a court hearing that could take his son away. "You're right," Rachel said calmly. "Gratitude would be a terrible reason to hire someone for a position this important. That's not why I'm offering it to you." She explained that when she was trapped in that car, dying, Lucas hadn't hesitated, hadn't thought about consequences, had seen someone who needed help and helped them. "That's not something you can teach. That's character. That's instinct. That's exactly what I need in someone overseeing emergency response." Lucas shook his head, explained about the custody hearing, about Vincent Hayes who would tear apart any job offer that looked like connections instead of merit. "Then let me testify," Rachel said simply. "Let me come to your hearing. Let me tell the judge what happened." She held out her hand. "I have a son too. Andrew, he's 9. When I was trapped in that car, all I could think about was that I might never see him again. You gave me that chance. Let me help you keep yours." Lucas looked at Caleb, who was watching with something dangerously close to hope in his eyes. Then back at Rachel, at this woman who'd walked into his falling-apart life carrying redemption in her hands. Pride warred with love, and love won the way it always should. Lucas took her hand. "Okay. Yes, thank you." The relief that flooded through him was so intense it hurt. Rachel smiled and pulled out a business card with her personal number. "Call me tomorrow morning. We'll go over details and prepare for Friday." She said goodbye to Caleb, ruffled his hair in a way that made him smile, and made her way to the door. Lucas walked her out, still feeling like he was in a dream that might dissolve if he moved too quickly. "Rachel," he said as she reached the stairs, "I don't know how to thank you." She turned back, silhouetted against afternoon light. "You already did. On Highway 26. Now go be the father your son needs. That's all the thanks I need." She left, and Lucas went back inside where Caleb was waiting with tears streaming down his face. "Dad, are we going to be okay?" Lucas pulled his son into a hug and held on tight, feeling the small body trembling against his chest. "Yeah, buddy. I think we're going to be okay." For the first time in 8 months, it felt like the truth instead of a lie he was telling to make them both feel better. Friday morning arrived with the weight of everything Lucas had been dreading. He dressed in a new suit that actually fit, purchased with money Rachel had advanced him, and helped Caleb get ready. The courthouse was downtown, all granite and judgment, designed to make people feel small. Vincent Hayes was already there with Bethany, who looked good and stable and confident in ways Lucas hadn't felt in months. She didn't meet his eyes. "Mr. Gray," Vincent said with fake politeness and real contempt. "Glad you could make it. I was half expecting you to miss this appointment, too." Lucas ignored him, settled Caleb on a bench with a kind bailiff, and followed Vincent and Bethany into the courtroom. Judge Patricia Morrison presided, steel-gray hair and an expression that gave away nothing. She reviewed the case file in silence, then looked up over her reading glasses. "Mr. Hayes, you filed this motion on behalf of your client requesting full custody of the minor child Caleb Gray. Please present your case." Vincent stood and presented his evidence with practiced efficiency. Bank statements showing Lucas's depleted accounts, the eviction notice, records of missed appointments. Each piece of paper felt like a nail being driven into a coffin. Bethany testified about her concerns regarding Lucas's emotional instability and inability to maintain employment, making it sound reasonable and compassionate instead of what it really was. Judge Morrison asked Bethany about Lucas's relationship with Caleb during their marriage, and Bethany admitted he'd been a good father then, before everything fell apart. "I'm worried about what Caleb is learning from him, about instability, about failure." Lucas's hands clenched into fists beneath the table as his court-appointed attorney Sarah Kim stood to present his defense. She talked about his decade of service as a paramedic, his dedication to Caleb, his clean record aside from the single protocol violation. But it all felt thin against Vincent's mountain of evidence. Then Sarah said, "Your Honor, I'd like to call a witness. Ms. Rachel Thornton." The courtroom doors opened. Rachel entered, moving more easily now with just a button, wearing a charcoal suit and an expression of absolute authority. Vincent's face went pale. "Your Honor, I object. This witness isn't on the list, Your Honor." Sarah interrupted. "Ms. Thornton only became aware of this hearing 2 days ago. Given the relevance of her testimony, I'm requesting the court's indulgence." Judge Morrison studied Rachel for a long moment. "Ms. Thornton, please state your name and occupation for the record." "Rachel Thornton, Chief Executive Officer of Meridian Health Systems." Vincent sat down slowly. Judge Morrison leaned forward. "What's your connection to this case?" Rachel explained about the accident, about Lucas pulling her from a burning vehicle at significant personal risk, about missing his interview because he was saving her life. Her voice was clear and steady, carrying the weight of absolute truth. "What Mr. Hayes failed to mention is that the interview Mr. Gray missed was with my company. When he didn't arrive, I wanted to know why. When I learned what he'd done, I sought him out." She looked directly at the judge. "Your Honor, I've spent 20 years in healthcare administration. I've reviewed thousands of candidates. Mr. Gray has the kind of instincts and character that can't be taught." Vincent tried to interrupt, claiming this was gratitude, but Judge Morrison told him to sit down. She asked Rachel if she was offering Lucas a position out of gratitude. "No, Your Honor. I'm offering him a position because he's qualified for it. His resume speaks for itself." Rachel pulled out a folder containing letters from Margaret Chen's family, thanking Lucas for his care and compassion. Judge Morrison read in silence, the courtroom so quiet Lucas could hear his own heartbeat. These letters indicate that the family specifically thanked Mr. Gray for his efforts, that they felt he showed more care than any other medical professional involved. Rachel nodded. Mr. Gray was fired for breaking protocol, not for incompetence, for trying to save a life when he was told to wait. That's exactly the kind of character I need. She explained the position. Director of Emergency Response, 90,000 annual salary, full benefits, 10,000 signing bonus, starting Monday. Judge Morrison looked at Lucas for the first time since the hearing began. "Mr. Gray, stand up, please." Lucas stood on legs that felt like water. "Your employment history over the past 8 months concerns me. Living in a situation unstable enough to result in eviction concerns me." She paused, and Lucas felt his world contracting. "But what concerns me more is the idea that doing the right thing should be punished, that prioritizing human life over personal advancement is somehow a character flaw." She looked at Vincent. "Mr. Hayes, your client has painted Mr. Gray as unreliable, but the evidence I'm seeing suggests a man who makes difficult choices and lives with the consequences. A man who puts others before himself, even when it costs him everything." Back to Lucas. "Mr. Gray, I'm granting you continued custody of your son. We'll review this case in 6 months. If you're employed, stable, and providing adequate care, this matter is closed. Do you understand?" "Yes, Your Honor." The gavel came down like a bell, like a reprieve, like every hope Lucas had been too afraid to hold suddenly made real. He walked out of the courtroom and knelt down as Caleb ran to him, pulling his son into his arms, while Caleb cried the kind of tears that had been building for months. Rachel appeared beside them, smiling. "Congratulations." "Thank you," Lucas said, the words completely inadequate. "You don't have to," Rachel said gently. "You already saved my life. Letting me help save yours is the least I could do." She looked at Caleb. "Your dad's going to be working at my company. We're going to be seeing a lot of each other. My son Andrew would love to meet you sometime." 2 weeks later, Lucas stood in his new office at Meridian Health Systems, looking out over Portland through floor-to-ceiling windows. On his desk sat a photo of Caleb and the orientation materials Rachel had given him. It felt surreal and earned at the same time. Rachel knocked and walked him through the facility, introducing staff, showing equipment, explaining systems. Lucas listened carefully, felt the old muscle memory of emergency medicine coming back to life. This was what he was meant to do. This was who he was supposed to be. "You're going to be great at this," Rachel said as they finished the tour. "By the way, Andrew and I are having dinner this weekend. He's been asking about Caleb non-stop. Would you two like to join us?" Lucas thought about his son, about the way hope was returning to their lives like spring after brutal winter. "We'd love to." That evening, Lucas picked up Caleb from school, their new routine, one he'd never take for granted. They drove past Highway 26, and Caleb looked at the place where everything had changed. "That's where you saved Ms. Thornton." Lucas nodded. "I'm proud of you, Dad, for stopping, for helping her even though it was hard." Lucas felt his throat tighten. "You know what? You reminded me to do it. When you said I had to help her, you were right. Sometimes doing the right thing is the only choice, even when it costs everything." Caleb considered this. "But it didn't cost us everything. We're okay now." "We are, buddy. We really are." They drove to their new apartment in comfortable silence. Inside, Lucas made real dinner with fresh vegetables and protein, and they ate together, talking about school and work and the dinner they'd have with Rachel and Andrew on Saturday. Later, after Caleb had gone to bed, Lucas stood at the window looking out at city lights. His phone buzzed with a message from Rachel. "First week survival kit arriving tomorrow. You're going to do amazing things, Lucas." He smiled and set the phone down. In the other room, Caleb was sleeping peacefully for the first time in months, no longer worried about eviction or court hearings or uncertain futures. That alone made everything worth it. Lucas thought about Margaret Chen, about the letters her family had written that he'd never known existed, about how sometimes trying was enough, even when the outcome wasn't what you hoped for, about how the worst moment of his life had led eventually to this, a second chance wrapped in tragedy and redemption, and the simple act of refusing to drive past someone who needed help. He pulled out his wallet and found the police report from the accident, folded small. He unfolded it and read the officer's words. Subject Lucas Gray displayed exceptional courage and medical expertise. His actions directly resulted in saving the victim's life. Lucas had spent 8 months thinking of himself as someone who'd failed, who'd lost everything, who couldn't provide for his own son. But maybe the true story was about a man who kept making the hard choice, who kept choosing people over security, who kept trying even when trying had cost him everything before. 6 months later, Lucas stood in Judge Morrison's courtroom for the review hearing. Vincent Hayes wasn't there. Bethany had decided not to contest custody, had accepted that Caleb was where he needed to be. Judge Morrison reviewed the file carefully. "Mr. Gray, I see you're still employed, still in stable housing. Caleb's school reports are excellent. It appears you've done exactly what you said you would do." "Yes, Your Honor." She nodded. "Then this case is permanently closed. Full custody remains with you. Congratulations, Mr. Gray." The gavel came down one final time, and Lucas felt the last knot of fear release. Outside the courthouse, Rachel was waiting with Andrew and Caleb. The boys were playing some elaborate hand game, laughing. Rachel smiled when she saw Lucas. "How'd it go?" Lucas exhaled slowly. "Closed. Permanently. He's mine." Rachel's smile widened. "He was always yours. The court just made it official." They went to lunch at a diner the boys loved, and Lucas watched his son laugh with his friend, watched Rachel smile at something Andrew said, thought about the strange, beautiful way life had unfolded from that moment on Highway 26. He'd chosen to save a life when logic said, "Protect yourself." And somehow, impossibly, he'd gotten his future back, too. Different than he'd imagined. Better, maybe. Built on something more solid than desperation. Built on the simple truth that who you are matters more than what you have. That doing right has value even when the cost is high. That second chances sometimes come from the most unexpected places. That night, putting Caleb to bed, Lucas sat on the edge of the mattress and brushed hair back from his son's forehead. "You okay, buddy?" Caleb yawned. "More than okay. Dad, I love you. I love you too, Caleb. More than anything." Caleb's eyes were closing. "Everything's good now, Dad. Everything's finally good." Lucas kissed his forehead and turned off the light. In the living room, he stood at the window looking out at the city, at all those lives intersecting and diverging, at all those moments of choice that defined who people became. He thought about the man he'd been 8 months ago, desperate and terrified, about the choice on a highway that had seemed to cost everything, but had somehow given him this: stability, purpose, his son, and maybe something that looked like love with Rachel. His phone buzzed. Rachel. "Thank you for today. Sleep well, Lucas." He texted back. "Thank you for seeing who I could be when I couldn't see it myself. Sweet dreams." 3 dots appeared. "Looking forward to that camping trip next month. It's going to be amazing." Lucas smiled. "Yeah, it really is." He looked at his reflection in the window, scarred and tired, but no longer broken, no longer drowning. He'd made the right choice that morning. It had cost him everything. And it had given him everything back. Transformed, redeemed, more precious because he knew how close he'd come to losing it all. "Thank you," he whispered to the night, to Margaret, to Rachel, to everyone who'd believed in him. "Thank you for the second chance." The city lights glittered below, full of stories and choices and people fighting their own battles. Lucas turned away from the window and went to bed, knowing tomorrow he'd wake up and do it all again. Go to work, pick up his son, have dinner, maybe text Rachel, maybe make plans. Normal things, beautiful things, the kind of things that felt like miracles when you'd been certain you'd lost your chance at them forever. He'd stopped for a stranger on a highway, and that stranger had given him back his life, not because of debt or gratitude, but because sometimes when you do the right thing for no other reason than it's right, The universe finds a way to balance the scales, to remind you that goodness matters, that character counts, that the hardest choices are often the ones that define us most completely. Lucas closed his eyes and fell asleep without fear, without doubt, with nothing but gratitude for the wreckage that had somehow saved him.